Stewart.
Okay, people. Okay, people. Let's let the honorables have a seat. And if you could somebody grab those doors for me, please? Thank you, Mr. Pascoe. So we'd like to thank you for joining us for this part of our day. We'd like to turn to a video and we'll ask Wilson to introduce.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug White, Wilson. I'm the chair of the BC First Nations Justice Council. We've got a very important segment of our forum here. I wanted everyone to know before we got started that when the Justice Council was talking about this important historic work for the first time First Nations leadership being recognized as having a say in the way the criminal justice system functions in British Columbia, when we thought about a keynote speaker for this event and for this forum, our dear and beloved Puglas came to mind and was at the top of our minds and in our hearts. Everyone knows how important Puglas is to all of us in this province. We know that through all of her work, I was honored to spend a bit of time with her on the Leadership Council of BC. We know all of the different ways that she's contributed to all of the lived reality of our peoples here in this province. We've seen nothing but consistent and resolved leadership, deeply principled, and in respect to the justice system and the defining moment that we're in of creating a new criminal justice system in BC, there is no doubt that Puglas, as a former prosecutor and most recently as the Attorney General, has a lot to offer in terms of insight and reflections. She has been always very clear about the vision that she has for this country, that in terms of the work that we're doing between Indigenous peoples and the rest of Canada, this isn't work that can be done in isolation by the Crown over here unilaterally. It isn't work that can be done in isolation by First Nations over here unilaterally. That what is necessary is a proper recognition that we're in a moment in this country where we have to ask ourselves the deepest and most fundamental questions about who we are in this country. Who are we as Indigenous peoples? Who are Canadians? And how are we going to craft something fundamentally different from what we've been through for the past 150 years? That we know that Puglas has had that clarity of vision that this is work that must be done together, that we have to be able to craft a shared vision that can drive us and propel us into a fundamentally different future for our children and for our grandchildren. Now, we've seen clearly and obviously a remarkable episode in Canadian political history. And what we see and know at the end of this, where we're at today, is that we have two remarkable individuals. Minister Philpott, Honorable Jane Philpott, who has been the Minister of Health and the Minister of Indigenous Services recently, is well respected across this country by Indigenous peoples. And it's our great honor to have them both here to deliver the keynote to the forum. They have demonstrated with great clarity that it doesn't matter what caucus you're in, what party you're in, whether you're a minister or not, that what we need and what we crave in these kinds of defining moments is clarity of leadership, purity of resolve and commitment to basic principles, the rule of law, that we can find a principled way through to craft a different future. So with that, on behalf of the First Nations Justice Council, I just want to extend my deepest gratitude. We're really honored by your presence and the fact that you responded to our invitation, both of you, to come and to share some words with us. Now, one of the leaders that has not been able to be here today, Grand Chief Stewart Phillip, has recorded a brief video that we're going to show now, and then we will move into the keynote. So if we can have that up and played. Thank you so much.
Why? Pisnaksil, Esquis, Asiut. I want to begin by acknowledging the Musqueam people, the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh. I would like to offer my regrets, my sincere regrets. I'm unable to make this this remarkable conference in Richmond, but on behalf of the Okanagan Nation and the Sealed people, we would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the BC First Nations Justice Council on organizing this incredibly important forum. It's very, very timely and certainly beneficial to our peoples who have always struggled with the archaic Canadian justice system. In particular, we would like to take this opportunity to express our deep respect, our love for Puglas, for Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott for their incredible stand they've taken against the absolute injustices that were perpetrated against both of these very strong principled women in regard to the shenanigans that were going on in Ottawa. Unfortunately, there is a very dark underside to the federal government, which is characterized government through the colonization and neo-colonial period. And we're so proud that both Jody and Jane stood up to that, spoke out publicly. We're certainly on the right side of history. And on behalf of the Okanagan Nation, we want to express our deep gratitude on behalf of our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. You've done a tremendous service to the Indigenous peoples of this country. You've set a very, very high standard, and you've inspired our people from coast to coast to coast. And we thank you for that. We sent our prayers and our good energy, and you know, we suffered in our hearts in regard to the way you were so horribly treated by the Trudeau government. And we will always stand in solidarity with both of you. And I look forward to the moment that I can give you both a big hug and you know, express my words personally. Joan and I are going to Indiana to the DePaul University to speak on justice and human rights issues. Otherwise, we would be at this event. So again, you know, we send our love and our deep respect, and as a consequence of both of you, alongside our sisters and brothers across this great land, we're walking a little taller today as a result of your courageous stand. Why? Lim Lim.
Please join me in welcoming our sister, our warrior, our hero, Puglas. Oh, there it is. Gaila Kasla. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Doug, so much for the warm welcome and the introduction. And that's pretty cool. First of all, I want to acknowledge the territory that we're on. Appreciate the remarks from Grand Chief Stewart Phillip. Want to acknowledge the Musqueam people, of course, the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh for allowing us to do this important business on your territory. And I'm incredibly pleased to see how many media are here and underscore how important it is for us to collectively address the justice system and the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the justice system. So thank you to the First Nations Justice Council for the invitation. Thank you to the province of British Columbia. Thank you to the First Nations Leadership Council, and to all of the chiefs, all of the matriarchs, ladies and gentlemen that are here. And I like looking at this cover because I had fun doing it with my good friend, Dr. Philpott, who's here, and I could not be happier that she's here to join us in these important discussions. And I look forward to her comments after mine. So, elders, leaders, community members, it is, of course, wonderful to be back here in Vancouver, to be among friends, family, and colleagues, and to talk about the important work that you are carrying forward, developing a province-wide First Nations justice strategy in partnership with the provincial government, work that is so urgent, vital, and long overdue. It is work that so many of us in this room fought so hard to advance over many years, and it is an important sign of progress that collectively you are putting together a joint provincial strategy that is finally being drafted and implemented, and it will take us all. So since I spoke to the leadership of British Columbia this past November, there have been a few developments. Things have changed a bit. Perhaps you are aware of them. Perhaps not fully unexpected, but certainly an eventful time. And to the so many of you who reached out to me, who reached out to Tim with your words of support and encouragement, we thank you very much. So, of course, when I spoke to you last in November, I was still the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. And the focus of my remarks then was about how true reconciliation requires courage, audacity, innovation, and a different approach to politics. Implied in this was how the challenges we were seeing in transforming laws and policies through new recognition of rights and implementation framework illustrated that we need to govern and make decisions in new ways. Indeed, when I went to Ottawa in 2015, I carried with me the belief that how we govern ourselves as Indigenous peoples carries important lessons for which Crown governments would do well to learn from. That belief is stronger today than ever before.
Today I want to offer a few reflections on the past few months and the past few years, and in particular what lessons it might hold for the important work that you're engaged in of transforming the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the justice system. One of the developments over the past few months was that, finally, in my last act as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, I issued a directive about the conduct of the Crown in civil litigation with respect to Indigenous peoples. The directive lays out 20 guidelines aimed at shifting how litigation is conducted in a more respectful, recognition-based, and focused on early settlement and measures to simplify legal proceedings. It is only a step, but it is a really important step and a step in the right direction. In fact, this directive took a long time to be finalized and released. From the time I first announced we were preparing it back in July of 2017, there were challenges. There were obstacles and there was some resistance. In order to move the directive along, a lot of work was done, including testing our approaches, educating and training lawyers, dialogue with experts, both internally and externally to the government, and starting to make shifts in litigation practices that would come to be expressed formally in the directive. I am pleased that the work of implementing the directive is ongoing and within the Department of Justice, and this work must continue. There were some within the establishment who were fearful that shifting from the norm of how the courts had been used against Indigenous peoples would be a costly mistake. Some who did not seem to understand that adversarial processes and the work of reconciliation are and will always be fundamentally in tension and typically at cross purposes. Some who importantly did not, and perhaps still do not, realize that uncertainty, conflict, and unpredictability arise because the denial of rights, not because of their recognition. And if not for the moral and legal imperative for justice, it just makes good economic sense. I mean, is it not just common sense that when people's rights are affirmed and as peoples and governments they are recognized, that the foundations for working together, collaboration, cooperation, and peaceful coexistence are stronger? And when people's rights are denied and not implemented, the foundations for conflict and uncertainty exist. Because the reality that a directive on litigation from a minister was even needed speaks volumes to the much more foundational challenges we still face. The patterns of perpetual, expensive, and seemingly endless litigation that we've fallen into is a symptom of a much deeper dilemma rooted in the history of our country and about how the law and the justice system has operated. Indeed, all of these terms, justice system, rule of law, administration of justice, and others, have meant something starkly different for Indigenous peoples than other Canadians. And it is that difference, that fundamental fact, that Canada's justice system has historically had a role in perpetuating injustice for Indigenous peoples, that we are all working so urgently to confront and change. In my recent testimony before the Justice Committee on February the 27th of 2019, respecting the SNC-Lavalin controversy, I observed that, quote, "The history of Crown Indigenous relations in this country includes a history of the rule of law not being respected. And I have seen the negative impacts for freedom, equality, and a just society this can have firsthand. I also stated that we either have a system that is based on the rule of law, the independence of the prosecutorial functions, and respect for those charged to use their discretion and powers in a particular way, or we do not. As these statements highlight, the rule of law is a principle intertwined with the highest values we uphold as society: fairness, equality, non-discrimination, upholding basic rights and fundamental freedoms, limitations on power, privilege, and undue influence. Values, when respected, applied, and upheld, are the critical foundation for inclusion, social cohesion, and democracy. When violated, there are significant risks of conflict, corruption, and the decay of the bonds and the ties that allow diverse peoples to live and build society together. And of course, as Indigenous peoples, we have our own vital and important understandings and application of the rule of law within our own traditions and legal orders, within our diverse protocols and teachings, and how our laws are expressed, whether orally, in story, in art, or in writing. One sees how all of us have a responsibility to uphold the law and the wide range of mechanisms, customs, practices, and expressions that must be utilized to ensure that occurs. And within our oral traditions, there is a paramountcy that we must place on the truth. It is recognized that if we do not voice what is true and pass it on, our societies will fracture and erode. Speaking and truth-telling can never be separated. This is a lesson which I believe Crown governments and our national system of politics certainly can learn from. With respect to Indigenous peoples, the failure to uphold the rule of law in the history of Canada has been one significant factor in the history of Crown-Indigenous relations. We all know this too well. Historic treaties have been violated, the legal requirement for treaty making ignored, the direction for the recognition of the Indigenous relationship with the land in the Royal Proclamation of 1763 ignored, the imposition of an explicitly race-based, segregated, and unequal Indian Act system, and how, right up until today, Indigenous peoples have been forced to prove their existence, the existence of their rights enshrined in the Constitution of 1982, in ways that charter rights, also enshrined in the Constitution in 1982, have not been. Of course, when I became Mojag, I had no illusion about this reality. I was not naive to the challenges, but rather embraced them, and still do, despite all that may have transpired over the past few months. This is the reality I had fought to change alongside all of you, and the reality I was committed to challenge in Ottawa. I believed then, and I continue to believe now, that making the fundamental shift from relations based on denial to those based on the recognition of rights is urgent, imperative, and requires transformative, foundational changes to laws, policies, and operational practices of both the federal and provincial governments. It also requires Indigenous nations to dramatically advance in tangible and innovative ways the work we must do to rebuild nations and governments, to set priorities, organize as proper title and rights holders, reimagine and strengthen governance and their legal institutions, and very importantly, increase the capacity to develop, legislate, and enforce their laws. This work should also be nonpartisan. This is not an arena of work conducive to political expediency, partisan games, cynical half measures, or rhetoric not backed up with action. This requires boldness, courage, and a vigorous agenda for change from all of us. And where progress is being made, the momentum must be maintained and encouraged. This need is clear across the spectrum of political, economic, cultural, and social issues that we face as Indigenous peoples and as a country. Nowhere is it clearer than in what you are discussing today: the relationship of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. And that is why I so greatly applaud the work that the leadership in British Columbia with the province is doing to undertake this joint work. Against this backdrop of the essential shift from denial to recognition and how it relates to the true meaning of the rule of law, let me offer a few more specific examples or observations about Canada's criminal justice system and the changes that are needed. I'm not going to go into detail about the legacy of colonialism, which is pervasive and ever present in the criminal justice system. We all know the statistics are stark. And I know that you are discussing them over the next number of days. So, like all of you, I know people that have, from a young age, gotten stuck in endless cycles into and out of the criminal justice system. This often starts, as I've said many times before, with a nonviolent crime and escalates to a life within the system, including the vicious cycle of court appearances, court orders, breaches of court orders, and then returns to custody. Throughout all of this, marginalization and victimization increase. The legacy of colonialism plays itself out in an ever more intense way in the daily life and experience of that person, victims, and those around them. Breaking this pattern requires multi-level approaches, and I'm glad to see that your strategy and the work that you are doing is framed as such. That the ultimate goal of the strategy you are designing is to figure out the proper relations between self-governing and self-determined nations regarding the administration of justice and the province's system, rules, and responsibilities also for the administration of justice. This is big picture. This is transformative. And also that your strategy, in addition to the systematically supporting and advancing that vision, will pursue immediate and tangible changes to address the urgent challenges that arise regarding how Indigenous peoples come into contact with the justice system and what transpires when they do. So let me reflect a little bit on the immediate changes and challenges and the bigger shifts in relation to self-governments. The types of immediate shifts that we focus on are well understood. We talk about restorative justice. I am a huge champion of restorative justice and know that governments need to invest significant dollars in the promotion of more restorative justice measures. We talk about the implementation of the Gladue decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in sentencing. We talk about the formation and recognize and acknowledge the work of our organizations, work like the Native Court Workers Association. We talk about retraining those within the justice system, such as prosecutors and the judiciary, and the development of First Nations sentencing courts, changes to the jury system and bail processes, and so on. And I have to give a plug because Bill C-75 is in the Senate, and this is the criminal justice reform, and I hope that is passed in this Parliament. All of these measures are vital and must be addressed in any strategy that is developed. Additionally, is the required work of supporting and investing in proactive programs and capacity that help build healthier communities and provide new supports, as well as significant innovation in rehabilitative measures in the corrections system. To be clear, making these immediate and incremental shifts also requires some far-reaching changes to Crown legislation and policy, both federal and provincial, in the near term. For example, and it is no secret, I have long believed and continue to believe that mandatory minimum penalties perpetuate the crisis of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the criminal justice system, and that many of the immediate challenges cannot be effectively addressed without the majority of mandatory minimum penalties being removed. To say it simply, MMPs feed the cycles of incarceration and over-incarceration, and our work needs to break those cycles. I firmly believe it is essential to moving forward and will continue to aggressively advocate for their removal. Another example is of a different nature. As First Nations people, we intimately know, of course, the tragedies that have afflicted individuals, families, and communities. For many Canadians, however, there has been more of an awakening to these realities in recent years with tragic stories of Colton Boushie and Tina Fontaine, for example. Painful and again tragic realities and experiences have been starkly revealed. Long-standing concerns with the administration of justice have had a light shone on them as Canadians from coast to coast to coast have begun to understand in new and renewed ways the histories and legacies that have led to these enduring challenges and the direction of change we must pursue. Of course, responding to and improving the existing justice system is only one aspect of the work, part of addressing the symptoms of what is wrong. But we also must address the underlying foundations. The core work is the work you must do as Indigenous nations, the work of self-determination and rebuilding your governments and legal orders with the support and partnership of the provincial and federal governments. There remains significant unfinished business or unfinished work to accomplish before Indigenous peoples have access to appropriate systems of justice, including Indigenous courts, so that they can enforce tribal and other laws as part of a multi-level system of evolving cooperative federalism, and that respects Indigenous legal orders. In the fall of 2018, I had announced plans for dialogue with Indigenous peoples on how to advance this. Venues for such dialogue, I hope and ensure, must continue. Some areas for justice reform as an aspect of self-government and self-government implementation will be easier than others. The work is already underway, albeit not fast enough, nor as well coordinated as it could be. But we should have no illusions, though. Doing this work, as it relates to the criminal justice system, will be one of the hardest, if not the hardest, arena for change. At Confederation, our criminal laws were confirmed as falling under federal jurisdiction in Section 91 of the Constitution. From that time onward, the criminal law of Canada was built up based on British law and with the passage of the first criminal code in 1893. Of course, in parallel was the launching of another reality, the passage of the Indian Act, which regulated the lives of First Nations peoples and made every aspect of our way of life, many aspects of our way of life, criminal. In the colonial mindset, rather than subjects to be protected by the criminal laws of Canada, we were and are often objects to be protected from. Rebuilding our own systems of justice, including our own courts and institutions, is vital to addressing this reality, and it is incumbent upon First Nations to lead it. In order to be effective in the administration of justice, it is also important we recognize, as mentioned above, the foundations that must be laid first. Moving out from under the Indian Act into systems and institutions built around our own constitutions is vital, and is building up the internal capacity for operating and growing those institutions. We also need to turn our efforts to the hard questions, including the ways in which we will choose to enforce our laws and how that enforcement will ensure the protection of all within our nations, including particularly the most vulnerable. We also have to think in very systematic and coherent ways about the issues of transition from the existing justice system, one which includes recognized roles for Indigenous laws and systems. There will be no one-size-fits-all model. It will necessarily have to look different and be attuned to how nations are driving forward their work and rebuilding their governments and their priorities that must be addressed. There will be issues of economies of scale and financing, regulation and accreditation, and what has in the past been called problems of pan-Indianism. where we conflate different cultures under the general rubric of being Indigenous. Of course, this work moving forward also requires the basic Crown recognition of Indigenous title, rights, and governments to take place. This is something that little over a year ago I expected was going to happen imminently, following the Prime Minister's historic words in the House of Commons. As you all know, this has not occurred, and I fear we may have temporarily fallen back into a less audacious, less meaningful conversation and mode of work that, while perhaps more comfortable, will not achieve the transformative space that is required. Of course, quarter-century-old policies need to be rewritten and negotiation approaches updated. But ultimately, the lifeblood of colonialism is written in the laws of this country, including the Indian Act, and how these laws deny our title and rights, and until the laws of Canada are changed to be based on recognition, fundamental patterns that need to be altered will remain with us. While steps forward are being taken, they are not happening as coherently, systematically, and quickly as is needed to set us on a proper and necessary path based on rights recognition. My fear and disappointment is that despite sounding the alarm, providing advice, pushing and challenging, sharing perspectives of lived Indigenous experience, providing a lens into the reality of being Indigenous, the federal government has fallen back once again into a pattern of trying to, quote, manage the problem with Indigenous peoples and make incremental and limited shifts rather than transforming the status quo. In my view, it is never appropriate or proper to have as a goal managing the challenges and the byproducts of colonialism. The goal must be to right the wrongs, to address the wrongs, to change patterns, transform the foundations, and all that we do must be framed to achieve these goals. Again, this is where Crown governments have much to learn from us. We have experienced colonialism. We understand it, and we have the solutions. Despite the setbacks, I am confident that we will not move away from our solutions, and we will remain vigilant. We have come so far. Indeed, although it was my expectation that the review of laws and policies that the federal government was to undertake in accordance with the 10 principles that the government released in July of 2017 would have happened earlier in the mandate, now at the 11th hour, there is a push to revisit the so-called comprehensive land claims policies and self-government policies. Kim Baird and Tom Isaac, as I understand it, have been tasked with this work. When it comes to the administration of justice and as it relates to the work that the BC leadership is undertaking, I believe that it is through the revised policies on self-government, including the new fiscal policy with respect to funding self-governments, that the internal direction to the federal government will be given on the scope and extent of what the government sees possible in this area. And it goes without saying that we need to ensure, with respect to justice and other matters of importance between Indigenous peoples and the Crown, that our voices must be heard and these policies and laws revised based on recognition, not denial. So this brings me to some final observations that I would like to share about the work of advancing reconciliation, including transforming the justice system, and what this tells us about politics and political culture that currently exists in Canada. To say it differently, reconciliation reminds us how desperately a different form of politics is needed in this country, one with a new political culture. Reconciliation is a challenge that is vital to the survival and well-being of children, women, and communities across this country. To meet this challenge, hard choices, innovative actions, transformation in laws and policies, new understandings and attitudes, and new patterns of behavior are needed. Long-term vision is needed. A willingness to think concretely about the next generation is needed, and how to build that. The leadership to not take for granted the status quo of how things are, and to challenge them. The strength to know that this requires working across party lines, building support for bold ideas that can endure. Over the last number of years, and especially over the last number of months, I have heard from Canadians all across the country yearning for this new kind of politics. And in this regard, I think we, as Indigenous peoples and leaders, have much to share and teach the rest of the country about how, despite differences, our diverse teachings encourage us to strive to maintain a focus on achieving consensus. How, despite great obstacles, our legal orders and systems of justice have been maintained, and we continue to work to improve and advance them. And how we understand the roles and responsibilities that must be played within our governments and societies, how all of these roles are intended to contribute to advancing the well-being and health of all. Doing the work of Indigenous or as Indigenous self-governments to develop our own systems for the administration of justice while also reforming the current systems of justice that fall under other jurisdictions will be a major and essential contribution to the future of Canada. The overall success or failure of rebuilding Indigenous nations in Canada and the successful implementation of self-government will in large part be determined by how well Indigenous nations can enforce and adjudicate their own laws, as well as other governments' laws, and how well such systems fit within the broader legal system in Canada. I look forward to seeing how your strategy continues to develop and how it is implemented over the coming years, and how it will affect this much-needed transformation. And I also look forward to finding ways that I can support this vital work. So as a last word, I just want to say, or I just want to share, that today and every day, I do remain optimistic and hopeful. Despite the challenges of the past few years and months, the path to progress and change is marching forward, and I think constructive work led by Indigenous peoples is accelerating. We are seeing work being done together in ways that we have not seen before, and this is vitally important. This does not stop, nor is it dependent on one voice or one person. Of course, this is collective work that generations before us have carried forward and which we are carrying forward now. The vigilance we must continue to have is to ensure that the work that is being done remains grounded, rooted in principles and standards, and that the solutions being developed will truly result in honoring and respecting Indigenous laws, governments, and jurisdictions, whose ultimate goal is to improve the quality of life for our peoples, so we can care for our peoples, communities, and the lands as we must. Indeed, as self-determination and self-government advances, we see how it also strengthens the well-being of Canada and all Canadians, including our social fabric, cohesion, culture, and economy. Gala Kusla for the work that you do. I look forward to seeing it continue. Thank you.
Haichkasiam Puglas, Tina Aitziais, thanking you for your good work. Now please join me in welcoming our friend, our colleague, and our champion, the Honourable Jane Philpott.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your generous and warm welcome and greetings, and good afternoon to all of you. I would like to start as well by acknowledging the territory of the Musqueam peoples that we're gathered on here today, acknowledging as well the Tsleil-Waututh and the Squamish nations who are in this area and who have allowed us to gather at this place today. I want to thank Leah. Where did she go? Over there, she's run out. For the introduction, I want to thank Doug and the entire team at the First Nations Justice Council for your kindness and generosity in inviting me to join you here today for this very special occasion, to hear about the work that you're doing together, and to give me a few moments to make some comments. Of course, I'm honored to share this speaking time with my very dear friend and colleague, Jody Wilson-Raybould. I'm happy to be back in beautiful British Columbia. I had actually hoped to be here in January when I was Minister of Indigenous Services, and had a trip that I was very much looking forward to that I had to cancel when I was shuffled to a different cabinet position, and have not had the opportunity to come back to British Columbia until now. So thrilled to be here today. Thank you for asking me to speak at a Justice Council event. As you probably know, I'm not trained in the legal field, but I hope that I will have something to contribute to your discussions at this event as you study Indigenous justice, based on some of the observations I've made over the last number of years, in particular, what I've learned about the daily lives of Indigenous peoples in this country and the serious socioeconomic injustices in particular that persist in our country. When Puglas was giving me some advice about what to say today, she said, people will want to know a little more about you. And I know many of you already, but not all of you know me particularly, so I thought I would share with you a little bit about my background. Some of you are familiar in particular with my political career, and particularly recently. I am proud of many other parts of my life, including the fact that I am a daughter and a sister and a wife and a mother of 4 adult children. I spent most of my working life as a family doctor, and my career was particularly shaped by the first 9 years of my medical career when I worked in the country of La République du Niger in West Africa. And it was there that I learned firsthand about the severe injustices of our global political structures. I was living and working in a country where at that time 27% of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. And I learned about the social injustices that span the globe, and decided at that time that I wanted to spend the rest of my working life doing whatever I could to tip the balance toward greater fairness. Which brings us back to the issues that you're discussing today. And I thought I would use the time that I have to share with you some of what I learned when I was Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. I hope I will share some of the good news and positive progress that Canada has made in many of the areas, as well as, of course, the barriers that we face as a country. I was Canada's first Minister of Indigenous Services, and therefore had the opportunity to be able to shape some of the department policies based on what I learned as I met with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities and leaders across the country. And on that basis, we chose 5 priority themes, each of which I'm going to touch upon very briefly today. The first priority was something that I heard you talking about when we joined you in the latter part of the morning session today, and that is the reformation of child welfare in this country, and it links very much to the work that you're doing. I knew that there was a lot of work to be done in this area, but I must say I was shocked when I learned more about the facts. I will never forget the first trip that I took as Minister of Indigenous Services when I went to Manitoba and was presented with information from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs based on research that they had done. I was shocked to learn that every single day in the province of Manitoba alone, every single day, an infant is apprehended from his or her parents, often before even leaving the hospital. I learned about the policy of birth alerts that sets up parents for failure rather than identifying families who might need support or providing them with the tools and resources that they need for successful parenting. I was told about the discriminatory policies that punish families for their poverty or their health issues by taking children away rather than addressing or trying to solve the underlying challenges that families face. But I also saw some very positive work being done by First Nations across the country. Here in British Columbia, in particular, I was blessed, for example, by the work and the teachings of Cookpee Christian, who has advocated for decades for the laws of his nation to be recognized, affirmed, and supported as they relate to caring for children. And Chief Christian and others supported me in ceremony and gave me the strength that I needed in order to carry the important messages of their communities back to Ottawa and to the Prime Minister. Earlier this morning, I heard Chief McLeod talking about the amazing work that they are doing in their community as well on transforming what child welfare looks like. I had the privilege of announcing resources to support some of the excellent work that's being done in British Columbia, including, for example, the exemplary work that's being done by leaders and social services workers in the Hwayet First Nation. I'm pleased to say that one of the results of this work was the tabling of a bill in the House of Commons, C-92. It is a response to the direct call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission number 4 that there should be federal legislation as it relates to child welfare. The piece of legislation that was tabled by the Minister O'Regan, who followed me, is a strong piece of legislation. It contains important provisions associated with the recognition of rights. And its strength would not be what it is were it not for the work of someone else in this room, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafont, and I don't know where Mary Ellen is sitting. Mary Ellen is one of the unrecognized heroes of this work. You all know her reputation in this area. She was the chair of the legislative working group that did the magic of pulling together a whole range of recommendations, and I thank her for that. The bill is not perfect. It has been criticized in particular for its absence of statutory funding. And so the government has some important decisions ahead, and I believe that there are opportunities yet to strengthen this legislation even more, and I hope to do what I can in that area. As it relates to your larger theme of First Nations justice strategy, one cannot overemphasize the importance of dramatic reform in the recognition of rights in child welfare. I don't need to convince anyone in this room that the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child welfare system is directly linked to the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in rates of homelessness, missing persons, suicide, homicide, problematic substance use, incarceration, human trafficking, and more. You know better than I the critical importance of children growing up in their own culture, surrounded by their land, their language, their lineage. So many of your communities are doing good work to make this the reality, but federal and provincial governments are still not sufficiently seized with the urgent need for reform. The second priority area for work in Indigenous services is education, and I won't spend a lot of time on this issue, although it is, of course, critical. As in many areas, BC First Nations, along with the province, have been leading the way. I'm delighted to know that after months of hard work, the second BC Tripartite Education Agreement was signed in January. That's what I was supposed to get to do, but didn't get to at the last minute. But I'm glad it was signed. And finally, across the country, we can say that as of now, funding for First Nation students on reserve is as good as or better than provincial funding systems. But that is not to say that there are not massive gaps that remain. In particular, I have been shocked to discover the gaps in educational infrastructure, with hundreds of schools on reserve in need of major investments. When students from Kashechewan First Nation in Northern Ontario came to Ottawa last year, and I learned about the facilities in which 400 children were receiving their education, I was aghast. Their school consisted, and still to this day consists, of moldy portables in which the doors won't close, and there are holes in the floor, and there are no recreational facilities. It is unconscionable that any family in this country should be expected to accept such conditions. And worse still, that there is no system under which alarm bells are sounded to alert the department of the desperate need for intervention. Happily, we did manage to secure $15 million to make sure that they have a temporary modular school that will be ready for September until a longer-term solution can be built. The third department priority was health. Here again, BC has led the way with the work of the BC First Nations Health Authority, which is now a model for other regions who are slowly working towards self-determination in health services. The BC First Nations Health Authority has been a model to demonstrate the important links by which the recognition of rights is the foundation for addressing the social determinants of health, which in turn are the foundation for improving public health and primary care, which in turn will lead to better health outcomes. I know it's not perfect, but your communities deserve credit for showing the rest of the country what can happen when First Nations are in charge. And I should commend the entire BC First Nations Health Council. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Evan Adams and others at the Health Authority for the impressive leadership that they have shown in an important area of educating health professionals in the area of cultural safety and cultural competence. This is now being modeled across the country and is essential for addressing the very serious challenges of stigma and discrimination against First Nations that exist in health systems across this country. There's another related area within the health domain where I would like to see us push ourselves much harder, and that is in the training of Indigenous health professionals. I've been trying to push for a commitment to revive one of the recommendations from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples written in 1996, which called for the training of 10,000 Indigenous health professionals in Canada over 10 years. Governments tend to do better when they set clear goals for themselves, and I think this is something that we could push both federal and provincial governments to collaborate upon. Within the topic of health, like education, there are disturbing infrastructure gaps that we need to keep fighting to address. One of the worst examples hit the news again recently, and that is the need for a treatment centre in Grassy Narrows in Ontario. I hope you will join me in calling on Canada to follow through with the commitment that I made to this community in the fall of 2017. No doubt you are familiar with the terrible history of industrial mercury contamination that goes back now for more than half a century. And this community has been asking for an on-reserve health facility in which to care in particular for people with chronic needs and serious health issues associated with mercury contamination. I want you to consider that our country now has annual federal spending of $350 billion a year. That's 12 figures, $350 billion. If we cannot assure the community of Grassy Narrows that we as a country will find a way to support the construction of a health facility that will cost something in the order of $10 to $20 million, then our moral compass is very much in need of a reset. You're getting the message, as if you didn't already know this, that infrastructure is a huge need across the country for First Nations, both on and off reserve. It turns out that this is the fourth area of priority for Indigenous Services of Canada, and I know many of you are in particular concerned in this area, of course, for the needs in urban areas. But you may also know that the estimated infrastructure gap on reserve is estimated to be about $40 billion, and it grows by about $1 billion each year. The country still lacks a proper plan to address this gap, despite significant new investments, which means that there's a great need for creative solutions in the area of policy, funding, training, and the creation of First Nations institutions and more. Housing on reserve is probably the most critical need to address. On this, I have been shocked and saddened by what I have seen across this country. For generations, Canada has been content to spend a bare minimum amount of money to build what has been described by some as, quote, disposable homes on reserve, end quote. In remote communities that are full of stunning natural resources of rocks and trees, where strong, intelligent people of all ages remain untrained and unemployed, for decades, we have shipped in ugly boxes made of cheap synthetic materials to sprinkle that landscape with buildings that aren't durable, don't inspire pride of ownership, don't express any regard for beauty or tradition or culture. These boxes passing for homes don't last. They aren't adequately serviced with plumbing and basic facilities, and they become moldy, crowded, and unhealthy, both physically and mentally. Thankfully, that is not always the case. I have seen stunning examples of what is possible, including, for example, the beautiful traditional roundhouses that I saw last year in Skeetchson First Nation. But there's not nearly enough funding or support, let alone the policies to facilitate new approaches to housing and infrastructure. I've also seen some very creative ways to fund housing in urban areas, including communities who are solving housing problems while simultaneously bringing families together by using provincial funds that would have otherwise gone to paying foster families, and use those funds instead to pay for reuniting families and providing their housing needs and other social services. Let's do more of that. One more comment before I move on from infrastructure. I need to give a special acknowledgement to some of the incredible work of rebuilding that is taking place in this province in response to the terrible devastation of the wildfires of 2017 and 2018. I had the incredible privilege in November of visiting the absolutely beautiful Tahltan First Nation, and in particular Telegraph Creek. I can't tell you how impressed I was not only by the surroundings, the devastation caused by the wildfires, but also the leadership in this community of Chief Rick McLean and his team, who have been working nonstop to see their community restored and find ways that people can return home. I have to give a shout out to so many others. I think for example, of the work of the First Nations Summit, Grand Chief Ed John, Cheryl Casmer, and so many others who have been tireless advocates, along with the entire BC First Nations Leadership Council, on the proper investment that needs to be made in emergency response, including the critical need for funding for prevention and mitigation of the disasters of fires and flooding that have proved so devastating in your province in recent years. The last priority area for Indigenous services is the focus on economic prosperity. And I won't go into great detail here because we're running out of time, but you know that there is much more that governments could and should be doing to support in this area. For example, I hope you will continue to advocate for more access to capital, which can make a huge difference to communities who are, and provide a major return on investment for governments as well. One of my favorite initiatives in the economic portfolio of the department was the vision of the work of people like Harold Kalla and others at the First Nations Financial Management Board, as well as others in the First Nations fiscal institutions, in order to enable about 100 communities to have 10-year grants that started just a few weeks ago, in order to provide stable, predictable, flexible funding. Now, I know some have criticized this vision, saying that it potentially prolongs the colonial financial relationships under the Indian Act, and of course, improving the fiscal relationship with Canada requires the fulsome recognition of rights. But in the process of getting there, the opportunity to have long-term grants should not be underestimated as a tool to support the path to self-determination and self-government. In a similar way, some helpful work has been done to expedite processes, for example, associated with additions to reserve, that are still undertaken within colonial political structures, but could at least be improved upon in the short term. Ultimately, of course, the only way to economic prosperity, not to mention justice, is to fight for the recognition and affirmation of Indigenous rights and title. You know only too well that such recognition constitutes the minimum standard for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Well, that has been a quick overview of some of what I worked on for the 16 months that I was Minister of Indigenous Services. In some ways, I believe we made progress and we pushed for essential improvements in federal services, but there is much more to be done. How can we do better together? Your work on justice is probably the most important work of all, because it must transform the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. In the meantime, I believe that we must continue to push for the full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as the TRC calls to action. There's much more work to be done to educate Canadians about the truth, the history of this land. As a person who was educated in Canada, I'm ashamed of how little I understood about Canada's colonial past. And I've had an enormous privilege over the last 4 years to learn from so many of you, along with other First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in this country. Of course, I've also had the extraordinary privilege of learning from my friend, the one and only Puglas, who taught me by her words and by her actions how we need to move forward as a country to right the wrongs of our collective past and create a path forward, somehow finding a way to live together in peace and harmony. We have a long way to go to convince all Canadians of the urgent need for reconciliation. There has been progress in the past 4 years, but not nearly enough. I don't know what my own future holds from the point of view of politics or career, but I will always be an ally in fighting for the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples. The future of our country depends on getting this right. Finally, I will make a very brief comment on the challenges of recent months in order to thank you, all of you, for your incredible support and encouragement. The political shockwaves that hit Ottawa over the SNC-Lavalin case have been examined from many angles. One of the underlying lessons that some observers have noted is that there was a serious clash of cultures. In theory, there is a desire for diversity among people in politics. In reality, it seems that Ottawa is not entirely ready for people who approach leadership and responsibility from different worldviews. As a result, some voices were not heard or were not understood. And some have criticized me and Jody as being naive, as not understanding how things are done. Those critics failed to realize that the way things have always been done may not meet the standard of what Canadians expect from their political leaders. I'm exceedingly sad about how the circumstances unfolded, but I believe that someday we will look back at this year and we will see that our democracy has been strengthened because people stood up for its fundamental foundations. In the meantime, for my part, I hope to model the lessons I learned from some of you, lessons on how to be resilient and how to persevere. There is much more to learn and more to do. I will not forget what I've learned from Indigenous leaders, elders, women, and youth in BC and across the country. I will not give up on the fight for justice and equity within and beyond our borders, and I know that you won't either. Thank you for the work you do every day to make our country and our planet more fair for everyone. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you for those wonderful, inspiring words, both Puglas and Jane. Thank you for taking the time to come and be with us in this important moment. In our Koselish Hualmahwe, we feel like there needs to be some ceremony involved here. And I would like to call upon my brother, Willie. Here we are. Whose name is Chappaqua. Chappaqua. What's the young brother?
Again, on behalf of the family, the First Nations Justice Council, want to thank you all for taking a few moments out to help us in ceremony. I really want to acknowledge all of your presence here today. They tell us that our ceremonies depend a lot on you. In our culture, we come together with one heart, with one mind, with one belief, with one prayer. And we're going to call on you all again to help us in ceremony. You all have cultures and traditions, and you have beliefs on how you look after the Spirit and how we look after each other. And that's what we're going to call upon you to do again. We're going to carry on with our ceremony in a quick way, a fast Coast Salish ceremony. Some of you know in our ceremonies we can spend 12 or 14 or 16 hours in ceremony. So we're going to do our best to keep it in a time frame, but to honor the essence of what we're doing, the real belief of what we're doing. And so we're going to call upon a few witnesses we're going to call our family forward. We're going to call Wolf Adam. Wolf Adam, we're going to ask you to be one of the witnesses, CM.
Thank you for your hard work. I appreciate it a lot. I just learned how to do this. Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, good to see you.
Chief Harvey McLeod, we're going to ask you to be a witness, CM. I'll try my best to explain as we're going along as well the essence of what we're doing. In our culture, we would call upon witnesses that have traveled to spend time with us, that represent your family, represent your community, they represent your people. The witnesses, you have some responsibility in our culture, in our tradition, being oral. It would be your responsibility to remember the work of the day, and it would also be your responsibility to bring it back to the family, to the people, to the community that you represent, and to share the word of the work of the day. Darlene Shackley, going to ask you to be a witness. Siamala. Chief Rhoda Peters. Don't let her out of the room.